You're listening to The Green Flag with your hosts, Lukas Wacker and Kyle Cushman.
Next up, it's the biggest disappointment, the award nobody really wants from 2022, but we are including both driver and team for this award. This time around, we previously done just straight across the board, your biggest disappointment. I believe I chose Ferrari last time. So we decided, you know what? Let's break it up. There's some drivers that disappointed in 2022, and there were some teams that definitely disappointed in 2022. So let's break them up. And I think we'll start off with the drivers before we get into the teams, Kyle. So you lead us off. Who is your third nominee for the biggest disappointment driver?
This is a tough one. There were a lot of drivers this year that as sucked. There is every year, that I wouldn't say sucked, but had certain expectations and didn't quite meet those expectations. And there's a lot of different ways you could take this, from people that just flat out sucked, like you said, or people that didn't have the level of success that they were hoping for. Yeah. And for that, my number 3 biggest disappointment this year is actually Lewis Hamilton. Not winning a race this season, losing the overall season battle to George Russell. Given obviously everything coming into the season, the talk of wanting to go out, prove that he should have won the championship last year, go out, take it to Max Verstappen. It just never happened. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the car that they had, especially early in the season. But we also saw there was a lot of consistency from George Russell picking up top 5s early in the season that we didn't see from Lewis Hamilton. Now, as the year went along, there were a lot of those second place finishes, a lot of podiums, and ended up finishing the year pretty strong, but still finished 6th overall in the standings, which is his worst finish in a very long time. Actually, it's his worst finish of his career. He had finished 5th previous to that, but had never finished outside the top 5 in the season-ending standings. So taking into account all of that, the factors coming into the season, the big talk, trying to follow up the should-have-been championship with a championship-level season and not winning a race for the first time in his career, for me, even though it was a great season overall, Lewis Hamilton ends up being on the podium for biggest disappointment for drivers for me.
Interesting. I don't have him in my 3, but that is definitely a very good shout. We praise Lewis Hamilton a lot on this show, and this was this was the year that, he maybe definitely didn't live up to the expectations that we all set out for him, no matter what the car's level was.
It was statistically the worst year of his career. And for that, I think there's a lot of drivers you can put in that number 3 spot. But for me, I think it was worthy to note that, just given the expectations coming into the year.
Yeah, definitely. Third place for myself is Kyle Busch. Man, what a year. I feel like the last 2 times the last 2 times we've done this, he's been in my nominees for this. So
he won it last time, didn't he?
I think I gave it to him last time. Yeah. This year I can't give him the award as much as, I think some people would probably give it to him. It was a lot of things out of his control, but some things definitely within his control too, that led him to this point. Both on and off the track, I think Kyle Busch's year has just been one to forget. Like, it's just been awful. Since basically the Bristol Dirt win, it's just been downhill from there, losing the Oracle reported sponsorship, losing his ride with JGR, having the stretch of finishes there where he basically felt like a DNF'd or wrecked every single week. It was a really, really tough go mentally on him, and you could see it. And just the way that it ended with him going to RCR, not his first organization choice by any means, but he found a place that he at least could possibly win races next year, considering what Tyler Reddick was able to do in that car. But it's still a downgrade on what JGR has been able to build and what he has been able to build with that team. So just awful. Could have won a lot more races if reliability for Darlington, nailed a couple more restarts, didn't have a late caution, a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. And what ifs for Kyle Busch in 2022. But ultimately it was not what we expect from a two-time champion. And for somebody that is as skilled as he is, the last 3 years have been disappointing, to say the least, in terms of how much he's been able to win, which is he's already at 60. I mean, that's crazy to think about how many wins he already has. But when you think he's only had 4 in the last 3 seasons, it's definitely down on his average of what he was making before then. So hopefully a fresh change of scenery will lead to greener pastures for him next year. But definitely a disappointing year for him, but doesn't quite top the next 2 that I've got on my list.
Yep. And he was the one that I was tossing up between him and Lewis Hamilton for third for myself. So definitely. And it's important to remember that the win that he did get this year was kind of weird circumstances at Bristol Dirt as well. And so if not for that, we're maybe talking about him in the same way we're talking about my number 2 candidate, and that is Martin Truex Jr., who missed the playoffs this year. And overall, I think leading up into the playoffs, I was actually much higher on Martin Truex Jr.'s season. Just from a consistency standpoint, he was up there in like the top 5, top 6 season long in terms of points. And that's something that I really care about. It's the after missing on the playoffs. We saw great stuff from them at Darlington. And then it feels like that just kind of broke the camel's back when they had the issues at the end of that race.
Yeah.
After that point, just nothing kind of at the end of the season. Some really rough results, poor finishes, technical problems, poor finishes, whatever you want to call it. Looking at the end of the season, they had the top 5 at Kansas, but then after
even
that,
Homestead though. I mean, they had.
I was going to say, they have the top 5 at Kansas, but then after that, only 2 top 10s the rest of the year. And we're talking about a team that, if they had made the playoffs, was one of the favorites to go through and be at least a round of 8 contender, if not a championship 4 contender. And the only reason they missed out is because of a Austin Dillon win in the last race of the season, all that kind of stuff, of the regular season, I should say. But they didn't show anything in the playoffs. And because of that, he's number 2 of the disappointments for me, because they missed the playoffs, and then in the playoffs, they didn't show anything as well. Very similar season, I think you could say, in a lot of respects, to Kyle Busch, but the difference is that one in the win column. So for me, Martin Truex Jr., even though we had a really solid first half of the season, the back half missing the playoffs and all the other stuff, he ends up being the number 2 disappointment for me.
We're thinking on the same lines, Mr. Cushman. He's number 2 for me as well. I have a feeling we might have the same number 1, but yeah, Martin Truex Jr., for all the reasons you just outlined. It's funny to think about for the school podcast I did that I think he was going to be the biggest, disappointment, but I didn't anticipate it to be that bad.
In this way.
To miss the playoffs for a guy that finished second in the championship the year prior is, it's just crazy. I mean, you have to obviously look at the amount of different winners we had this year, almost a record-breaking number, as a big factor in that. But also, he wasn't in a position to win a lot of races as what he has been in previous years as well. And I think also the fact that the Toyotas struggled mightily on road courses and short tracks, a thing that he has become exceptionally good at in recent years, especially, definitely allowed to him, falling off a bit on those, race that he relied on getting good results from. And I don't know if they necessarily had that as much this year. I mean, road courses, Toyotas were atrocious this year, other than Christopher Bell's win on the Roval, but that's down to a 4-tire strategy call that Adam Stevens made, and it was the right one. But for Truex to miss the playoffs at JGR, to not even get a win as well afterwards, because a lot of people were like, oh, who's going to be like that guy that missed the playoffs, or, who's eliminated from the playoffs that could win? I think everybody pointed to Martin Truex Jr. as being that guy, because they were so consistent and you felt like they were on the verge of a win. And like you said, that Darlington result totally took the wind out of their sails. And then Homestead was finally like their last saving grace, it felt like, to maybe get that win. And they had the best car there at the end. But circumstances happen that are just out of his control. And he made a mistake as well there. It's not like it's, on a Larson or anything like that. He almost missed his pit stall, and that's on the driver as well. So just an uncharacteristic kind of season for Martin Truex Jr. And I'm sure he's definitely ready for the calendar year to turn over for a fresh start in 2023. So he finishes second for me as well.
Number one biggest disappointment in the driver category for myself, and this is a tough one to say, it's Daniel Ricciardo for myself. Just looking at last year, the first year with McLaren, there was a lot of kind of excuses made, I think is the fair way to characterize it, where he was stepping into a car that was set up for somebody else, different issues, blah, 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 whatever. Brand new start, brand new car. Things are going to be great. The success is going to come. And it got worse. And for that, the expectations of Ricciardo stepping into McLaren, not just from fans, but from the team itself, because of the money they put into him, all that kind of stuff. And to not even finish out the contract, to get bought out in year number 2, be replaced by a young driver and be a reserve driver going into 2023 is an incredible change of fortune from what we thought when this McLaren contract was signed. So for all of that taking into consideration, the 2022 year taking into consideration, the context taken into consideration, Daniel Ricciardo for me is the biggest disappointment of 2022. Yep.
Same for me. 100%. Man, that was like heartbreaking to watch in a lot of ways. I think we all hoped after that Monza win in 2021 that it would be like kind of like the spark that kind of sets him on the right track. And even after that, it wasn't,
never did,
that peachy. So, and then to start this year,
it's actually papaya orange.
Papaya orange. Yeah, fair enough. But, I think, as soon as the rumors started swirling, at least like at Monaco, and that's so early in the year for like those things for a driver move to potentially happen, it like your red flags were just immediately up in the air. And I think he was so rattled by all of that, as much as you have to obviously put on your best face for the media and for everybody in public. But I'm sure that all that stuff weighed heavily on him. And when you look at what Lando Norris is doing, doesn't make it any easier. And if you look at the point differential between those two last year, it was, around 40-ish points. And Lando obviously had a lot more bright moments, but Ricciardo was at least consistent, getting you points and still finishing the top 10 in the point standings. This year, I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, he was nowhere compared to where Lando Norris was. And I mean, Lando Norris is definitely somebody that we all think, if he had a better car, would be competing for race wins regularly or even a championship. I'm sure that will happen down the road eventually in his career. But for Daniel Ricciardo, a guy that we have, was looking for a fresh start from Red Bull to now be going back there as the reserve driver. I mean, that has just got to be a kick in the gut. Like, that is brutal for him to have to go back to a team that he left when he was at the top of his game, thought that he could go to the next level, try and become the number one driver elsewhere and lead a team to becoming a world championship threat, when in reality he's gone backwards and is nowhere near that level anymore. And he may be done an F1 for good. Who knows? Like, that could maybe be the last time we see him behind the wheel of an F1 car, because who would want to maybe take a shot on him to get the best out of a car when McLaren was a midfield team this year and he could not even remotely get close to getting the most out of a car, when it seems it has to be specifically designed to his driving style for it to be able to get the performance out of it. And for a guy that everybody loves within the paddock, he's so well respected for his personality and what he gives to the sport. That is not what this award is about. This is strictly on track. And for all the stuff to be paid to not drive for McLaren next year is, I mean, you can't not give this award to anybody else. So Daniel Ricciardo definitely is the biggest disappointment in 2022.
Yep. Completely agree on that front. Shall we get into the teams now?
We shall. Indeed. Do you want to go first for this one, or should I?
Sure. I'm good with whatever you want to go with.
You can go first for the teams.
Alrighty. For myself, number 3 on the biggest disappointment team front, we're going to the IndyCar side of things, and I will say Andretti Autosport for myself. Okay. It feels like every single year the past handful of years, it's been, this is the year Andretti gets back into the title conversation, and it still hasn't happened. There was a lot of talk about Romain Grosjean heading to that team and being a title contender, and just didn't formulate. Colton Herta, consistency issues. Alexander Rossi had a bounce back season and still barely cracked the top 10 overall in the standings. Their finishers being 9th, 10th, 13th, and then Devlin DiFrancesco being off the pace is just not what you expect from a team that has the Andretti name with it. And it's been a while. You look at the names Rossi, Herta, Grosjean, and those are three drivers that in theory could go out and win the IndyCar championship. And for them to finish 9th, 10th, and 13th in the standings is, again, disappointing from an Andretti perspective. They had pace at times, they had infighting at times, but overall just not the consistency at the front of the grid that I think a lot of people were hoping for in a really, really challenging IndyCar series. But looking at the strides that Penske made, Chip Ganassi still being up there, McLaren having both drivers finish ahead of every Andretti driver. Because of all of those reasons, for me, Andretti finishes number 3 in the most disappointing team for myself.
They're a team that I definitely looked at, no doubt. I mean, we've heard from Colton Herta for it feels like a lot of years now. I mean, it's not been a lot of years, but it feels pretty consistent that, man, this guy, watch out, title contender, and just can't quite get the results, week in and week out, race in, race out. It's been very much a struggle consistent wise. And I mean, he's been, hyped up potentially for an F1 seat. If that all worked out for the super license points, I think he's incredibly talented. It's just a matter of, just honing in on that craft a little bit more. And I'm sure that will come with time. But yeah, I agree. Andretti was definitely not up to par with maybe what we were expecting from them, considering their driver lineup. For my third, I'm going to be giving it to Stewart-Haas Racing in the NASCAR Cup Series. Man, if you didn't have Chase Briscoe, that year sucked for Stewart-Haas Racing in a lot of ways. I know Harvick had 2 wins. Those came back to back and was out in the first round of the playoffs. Chase Briscoe was a couple of laps away from potentially winning his way into the championship race, but Eric Almirola, nowhere. Cole Custer, nowhere. And he's lost his seat now at the Cup Series level to Ryan Preece. He's going back down to Xfinity, which is ultimately probably a good move for him. But there's a lot of, it feels like this has just been a downward trajectory here for a little while now. And Chase Briscoe was really the only bright spot for that team in terms of getting far in the playoffs. Consistency wise, though, during the season, he had some rough stretches too. Went on a big run in the playoffs that not many people saw coming. I think he was a first round exit for a lot of us, but he surprised a lot of people, and he was able to get that far to be in a position to maybe even challenge for a championship in his second year in the Cup Series. That's pretty remarkable. But at the same time, the numbers don't lie. And he did not have many top 10s, and he did not have many top 5s this year. And that's disappointing for a driver that, finishes 9th in the overall point standings. And, Kevin Harvick finished 15th in the point standings.
That's because of the penalty, though.
True. Very, very fair. But I actually kind of forgot about that. Not going to lie. But for Harvick, I just felt like they didn't have the race winning speed that they usually do. And, to go winless previous year to get 2 wins this year. I mean, Kevin Harvick is very much near the end of his Cup Series career. We'll maybe even find out by Daytona if this is his final Cup Series year coming up. But for a team that used to be really, really strong with at least 2 cars when Kurt Busch and Kevin Harvick were, top 8 contenders basically every week, it's definitely a very much a dip in form. And you thought with maybe a new car that could definitely, rejuvenize that team and just get a fresh start, and they can all get a bit of a reset. They went backwards, if anything, almost this year in a lot of ways. So they finished third for me for the biggest disappointment team wise.
Yeah. And Stewart-Haas is number 2 for me. Looking at the expectation level for this team is to have 3, maybe even all 4 cars in the playoffs. And we saw that. You mentioned the Kurt Busch, Kevin Harvick, throwing Clint Bowyer in there, not necessarily to be the top 8 guy, but to be the consistent playoff guy. And we haven't seen that over the last couple of years. And we've seen the performance tick off as well from the win perspective. Chase Briscoe had a resurgent playoffs, got lucky at times, but also you got to be good to be lucky. He went on a solid run. Kevin Harvick had the 2 wins, then went out in the first round, had the big penalty, docking him, whatever. But that didn't affect the fact that he went out in the first round. Eric Almirola, nowhere again this year. Cole Custer, nowhere again this year. This is a team that has the expectation of being a championship threat from one car and a playoff threat for the other 3 cars. And we haven't seen any of that really from this organization over the last couple of years. For that reason, Stewart-Haas remains the biggest disappointment for me in the second slot.
This one may be a bit out there for my second nomination here. Joe Gibbs Racing is my second biggest disappointment in 2022. I'd love to hear
the explanation here.
When you have a guy missing the playoffs and go winless in Martin Truex Jr., who finished second in the championship the previous year, raise a couple questions. When you got Kyle Busch only winning 1 race in a season, that's raising some question marks. Denny Hamlin was very, very bad to start the year consistency-wise, got that win at Richmond and then got another win as well, but it wasn't anything too crazy of a season for Denny Hamlin. He wasn't the guy that was challenging like Kyle Larson was head-to-head, week in and week out like he wasn't the previous year. Christopher Bell, the exception. He led that team the entire year, consistency-wise, and also in race wins by the end of it. Had that clutch factor in the playoffs that really propelled them to getting a very good season. But for Joe Gibbs Racing to fall off of a cliff in a lot of ways, race winning speed-wise, I think is pretty shocking. And when you look at, Hendrick Motorsports, at least Chase Elliott was able to get 5 wins. William Byron got 2 wins. Bowman got a win. Larson got 3 wins. Like, that's the team that I feel like, probably all around probably had the best wins wise. Consistency wise, you could definitely argue otherwise. But yeah, Joe Gibbs Racing was a big letdown for me, both on and off the track. And that is why, as well, off the track, how they handled the entire Kyle Busch contract stuff, I feel like was just disappointing as a Kyle Busch fan for myself as well. To let your ace kind of leave that has led the team for a lot of years, the best driver in their history, to walk out the door and it felt like they didn't make the most effort that they could have, is disappointing for sure. And the fact that they didn't have a backup plan for him for contract wise in terms of sponsorship status, that's not how it should be. I'm not going to tell Joe Gibbs how to run a race team, but I think that there's definitely a better way. I think that they can probably agree with it too, that they could have gone about getting him to stay at least. And I think that's a big loss for a team like that. I can't be understated how much he's brought to the Toyota power over the past 15 years, and also to that organization to make it a perennial championship threat year in, year out. The exception, obviously, they've made it to the championship 4 every single year this format's been in place. So that's obviously something that no team can say that they've done. But they didn't quite have the speed when they needed it to that weekend in Phoenix as well for Christopher Bell. Obviously, they had the pit issue there in that final stop. But before that, they weren't really like the Logano-esque kind of speed that we were maybe expecting from a Joe Gibbs Racing there at Phoenix. So overall, I when you have Martin Truex Jr. missing the playoffs, Kyle Busch going out as a first round exit, and then Denny Hamlin, almost making that final 4 as well. Could have had 2 cars in the championship 4, but they ultimately didn't. The race winning wise, the fact that they fell off that dramatically from previous years, a lot of teams did, understandably, with a new car. But for Joe Gibbs Racing, I just have high expectations for them, and they did not quite live up to those. So they are the second place in my biggest disappointment.
Yeah, I think that's way too harsh, personally. They had a car in the championship 4. They probably should have had 2 in the championship 4, if not for Ross Chastain's crazy moment at the end of the year. Every team that has won a bunch of races in the past had that drop off. Like Kyle Larson won double-digit races last year, something like that.
110, yeah.
And that's a big drop off there. Season-long points, all 4 cars were in the top 10. And if you want to focus on the Kyle Busch stuff, I think that's fair. But at the same time, Kyle Busch was also the worst in terms of season-long points out of JGR. So I think taking all of that into account, this is still a team that had relative success, had a car in the championship 4, probably should have had 2, all that kind of stuff. I think it's way too harsh to have them as a biggest disappointment.
It's fair. It's totally fair. But I don't know, man. It's just just a disappointing year, I felt like, from that organization overall, but that's just me.
But top 3 in motorsports?
Maybe they could have got down to 3, but that's personal bias coming in slightly for myself to bump it up to 2. Stewart-Haas Racing probably could have been second, but I still think they deserve a nomination there for the 3rd spot.
We disagree on that front.
Yes. One of the only rare disagreements we've had so far in this award show. We've been pretty steady.
Yeah. Anyways, to the number 1 spot. And I think this one is at least pretty straightforward, and that's Mercedes on the Formula One side of things. This is a team that has been perennial Constructors' Championship threats and weren't this year. They had a solid ending to the season in terms of consistency, getting a win there with George Russell to at least salvage at least that statistic. But overall, for a team that should have won the Drivers' Championship last year, won the Constructors, going into this year, having those expectations and completely flopping, especially in the first half of the year, I really don't see how they aren't the biggest disappointment from a team front in motorsports this year.
They are number 1 for me as well. When you win 8 consecutive Constructors' Championships and you fall flat like they did and had as many issues as they did to start the year, it's surprising in a lot of ways. And, you know, like obviously the testing stuff beginning in preseason testing, you know, everybody was like, at the Mercedes camp, at least they were like, I don't know. I don't know if we're quite there. And there's no real excuse for, you know, their lack of performance in a lot of ways, because if you're thinking, oh, well, they were in a big championship battle last year, they had to focus more on the 2021 car. Red Bull was in the exact same position, and look what they did this year. One of the more dominant years in F1 history in a lot of ways, with how fast of a car that they were able to bring week in and week out race pace wise. And Mercedes was a long ways off of that for the majority of the year. Like you said, they recovered a lot at the end of 2022 and ended up getting at least 1 victory to salvage their year in Brazil, but not what we expect from a team that has dominated the sport for basically a decade. And, you know, definitely the new regulations caught them off guard. They made a mistake in how they designed their car. Now it's more, I mean, I'm fascinated to see what they do next year. Do they entirely change the philosophy on their car? Do they think that the way that they were able to find speed at the end of the year proves that there's a path forward with the way that they've designed it? Or do they go with the Red Bull kind of model with the larger side pods and do they get rid of like the no side pods that they've run throughout the entire season? So they're a big question mark, a fun storyline to potentially watch at the beginning of next year, especially. So Mercedes definitely a letdown. And I think all the expectations were so high with George Russell coming into that car. Everyone was like, oh man, I can't wait to see what he's going to be doing, battling for race wins with Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen week in and week out. And in reality, he was just racing by himself in 5th place for a lot of the year. So definitely a disappointment. And they're the biggest disappointment for both of us in 2022 for the teams.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward when you have a team that goes from dominating for 8 straight years to not even being in consideration for the Constructors. I feel like that's a pretty clear criteria to be the biggest disappointment.
Yeah, and I want to give an honorable mention to this category for the teams to AlphaTauri. Terrible season for them.
Sure, yeah. I don't know. What are their expectations?
But I mean, for how well they've been so consistent in the midfield to finishing second last in the Constructors is quite a fall off from what we've been accustomed to seeing from them. And when you look at what Pierre Gasly was able to do, winning a race, I mean, you know, not that long ago.
Yeah, but like from that perspective, I get that. But like, what are their expectations versus where they ended up finishing? That kind of thing. Fair
enough. That's why I didn't put him in. But I do think that
I get it.
It's like I kind of just surprised me that they finished second and last in the Constructors. I think that's not what a lot of people thought maybe these new regulations would bring for a team like that. When you look at what Red Bull was able to accomplish as well, being the big team of that alliance. But nonetheless, Mercedes, we have another draw here, another sweep for our winner. Mercedes sweeps the team. And then, of course, Daniel Ricciardo sweeps the biggest disappointment for the driver in 2022.